stop borrowing your identity. The art of true independence. We are living in an era of unprecedented connectivity. Never before in the history of human existence have we been so physically reachable, so digitally tethered, and so socially saturated. We carry the collective noise of the species in our pockets, receiving a constant stream of opinions, emergencies, triumphs, and trivialities. We are told, from the moment we can comprehend language, that this connectivity is the ultimate mark of progress. We are taught that growth is an additive process, that a life well lived is a life populated by an ever-expanding network of people, ideas, and validations. We are taught, in short, that the truth of our existence can be found in the crowd. But look at the cost of this connectivity. Look at the state of the modern mind. We are more anxious, more distracted, and more deeply alienated from our own internal experience than any generation before us. We are suffering from a profound crisis of presence. We have become experts at managing our external presentation, while losing the ability to witness our internal reality. We have become so adept at navigating the expectations of others that we have forgotten how to navigate the silent, unvarnished truth of our own being. This book is an invitation to do the unthinkable, to withdraw. This is not a call for misanthropy, nor is it a mandate for permanent isolation. It is a call for a radical shift in perspective. It is an argument for the necessity of solitude as the primary laboratory for the human spirit. For centuries, the wisdom traditions of the world, and most notably, the path of the Buddha, have recognized a fundamental truth, that the crowd is a machine of conditioning. The crowd does not exist to reveal your nature, it exists to regulate your behavior. The crowd does not exist to help you awaken, it exists to help you conform. When you are always surrounded by the noise of others, you are effectively borrowing your identity from the collective. You are seeing the world through a filter of social consensus, mistaking the popular for the true and the normal for the correct. This work is intended to be a comprehensive guide to dismantling that conditioning. We will move beyond the superficial comforts of social life to confront the uncomfortable, expansive, and ultimately liberating truth of the individual mind. We begin with a simple, yet shattering, premise. The mind is a mirror, and the crowd is a storm of dust. As long as the mirror is being hit by the dust of external opinion, expectation, and reaction, it cannot reflect reality. It can only reflect the agitation of the world around it. To see the world as it is, to see yourself as you are, you must find a way to shield the mirror. This is the function of solitude. Over the coming chapters, we will navigate the topography of this awakening. We will explore the evolutionary traps that make the crowd feel like a necessity for survival. We will deconstruct the performative self, that exhausting mask we wear to ensure we are accepted by the collective. We will confront the fear of the void, the terror that arises when you strip away the social scaffolding and find yourself standing alone in the silence of your own existence. But most importantly, we will explore what remains once the scaffolding is gone. Awakening is not a dramatic event. It is the ordinary, subtle cessation of unnecessary suffering. It is the quiet recognition that you are not the chaos of the world, nor are you the narrative of your ego. You are the awareness that witnesses both. When you realize this, when you finally stop looking for your reflection in the eyes of the crowd and start looking into the depth of your own silence, you find that you are already free. The path we are about to walk is not a path of rejection. It is a path of reclamation. We are reclaiming our minds from the social machine. We are reclaiming our wisdom from the marketplace of opinions. We are reclaiming our peace from the demand that reality be anything other than what it is. This journey is not loud, it is not popular, it is not competitive, it requires no audience, and it seeks no consensus. It is a path of clarity, and clarity, by its very nature, has always been a solitary endeavor. Let us begin by silencing the noise. Let us step out of the crowd, not to turn our backs on the world, but to finally see it with eyes that are truly our own. Welcome to the architecture of your own awakening. Module 1, The Social Seduction. 1. The Evolutionary Trap. The biology of belonging. To understand why the crowd exerts such a gravitational pull on our consciousness, we must look beyond psychology and into the deep, prehistoric architecture of the human brain. We are not merely social animals by choice, we are social animals by biological mandate. For millions of years, The survival of the individual was inextricably linked to the survival of the group. In the harsh landscapes of our evolution, exclusion from the tribe was a death sentence. The lone human was a vulnerable human exposed to predators, unable to hunt effectively, and denied the reproductive security necessary to pass on their genetic code. Because of this, our brains developed an early warning system specifically designed to detect and fear social exclusion. When we feel ignored, judged, or left out of the group, the brain fires off the same primal distress signals as it does when we experience physical pain. We feel the sting of rejection in our nervous system as a literal threat to our existence. This explains why the desire for social approval is not just a personality quirk. It is a profound instinctual survival mechanism that has been hardwired into our amygdala for eons. In the ancestral environment, this instinct served us well. It kept us aligned with the tribe, ensured our participation in collective tasks, and maintained the social cohesion necessary to thrive. However, in our current world, this ancient wiring has become a source of immense psychological distortion. The social landscape has shifted from small, intimate tribes of 50 people to a global, digital, and hypersaturated environment where we are constantly exposed to the scrutiny of thousands. Our primitive brain, which still thinks we are living in that small tribe, does not know how to process this scale. It continues to panic at the thought of being alone, interpreting modern privacy as archaic exile. This is the evolutionary trap. We crave the crowd because we fear the silence, and we fear the silence because we still believe it means we are abandoned. We use social connectivity to soothe an anxiety that no longer serves a survival function. We are essentially living in a state of chronic, low-level fight or flight, fueled by the fear that if we step away from the crowd, we will cease to be. The first step toward clarity is the objective recognition of this biological bias. You are not bad or weak for feeling the urge to be around others. You are simply witnessing the activation of an ancient, obsolete survival software. By observing this instinct rather than obeying it, you begin to break the first link in the chain of dependency. 1.2 The myth of social completion. The beggar's mindset. This evolutionary fear of exclusion births a secondary, more insidious delusion, the myth of social completion. We are sold a cultural narrative that suggests we are born into this world as unfinished beings, and that the missing pieces of our personality can only be found through the external validation of others. We are told that we need a partner to be whole, a group of friends to be relevant, and a professional community to be significant. This narrative creates what we might call the beggar's mindset. When you believe that your wholeness resides outside of you, you inevitably approach every human interaction as a beggar seeking a handout. You are not approaching people as a free, complete individual capable of genuine connection. You are approaching them as a vessel that needs to be filled. This mindset dictates the quality of every relationship we form. If you are always looking for someone to complete you, you are incapable of seeing them as they truly are. Instead, you see them as a function of their utility to your sense of self. You become hypersensitive to their reactions, constantly gauging whether they are giving you the validation you crave. This dependency is the silent killer of intimacy. True connection can only occur between two people who are already standing on the ground of their own being. When two beggars meet, they do not connect, they collide. They entangle their insecurities, trade their anxieties, and form a codependent pact of mutual validation. They hold each other hostage in a dance of constant reassurance, terrified that if one person stops providing the validation, the other will fall into the void. To transcend this, we must recognize that the emptiness we feel is not a hole that needs to be filled by the crowd. It is an openness that needs to be inhabited. We feel incomplete only because we have spent our entire lives looking at the mirror of other people's opinions, rather than looking into the mirror of our own awareness. The myth of completion is the ultimate barrier to awakening because it justifies our avoidance of ourselves. As long as you believe the crowd can save you, you will never take the responsibility required to save yourself. You will remain in the peripheral vision of your own life, always chasing the approval of an audience, forever starving for a wholeness that is already, and has always been, yours to claim. To fully grasp the social seduction in our contemporary age, we must confront the reality of the digital environment. Never before have we lived in an era where the crowd is not just a physical reality, but a constant, phantom presence in our pockets. We have built a digital panopticon system where we are constantly being watched, evaluated, and categorized by an invisible massive collective. The evolutionary trap discussed in one. One is no longer an occasional instinct, it is a 247 stimulation loop. Our primitive brains, designed to seek tribal approval, are now being bombarded by the metrics of a global tribe. Every notification is a digital signal of inclusion or exclusion. Every like is a microdose of the ancient neurochemical validation that tells our brain, you are safe, the tribe accepts you. Conversely, the absence of these signals triggers a neurobiological alarm that our subconscious interprets as social death. This amplification of the evolutionary trap has created a new modern form of suffering, the anxiety of constant visibility, because we can now see what everyone else is doing, where they are, who they are with, and what they are achieving. The comparison reflex is no longer something we trigger in social settings. It is the default state of our nervous system. We are trapped in a feedback loop of social surveillance. We are watching the crowd, and we are performing for the crowd, and we have entirely forgotten that there is a version of self that exists independent of being perceived. 1. For the erosion of private reality. The consequence of this constant visibility is the slow, steady erosion of private reality. Private reality is the mental space where we dream, where we experiment with uncomfortable thoughts, where we process our grief, and where we cultivate our personal wisdom. This is the space where the self is forged. In the digital age, this space is under siege. We are incentivized to turn every private moment into a public commodity. We share our meals, our workouts, our travels, and our political opinions. Not necessarily because they need to be shared, but because the ego fears that if an experience is not socialized, it did not truly happen. This is the ultimate victory of the social seduction. It convinces us that our internal life is merely raw material to be curated for the crowd. When we surrender our privacy to the social machine, we lose the ability to have experiences that are purely for ourselves. We start to experience life through the lens of potential output. We look at a sunset and think, how can I capture this, rather than simply seeing the sunset? We look at a personal struggle and think, how can I frame this as a lesson for others, rather than simply feeling the struggle? By losing our private reality, we lose the ability to know who we are when the audience leaves. We become hollowed out, a collection of curated moments rather than a center of genuine awareness. The path toward clarity requires us to perform a digital and social audit. It requires us to identify those areas of our life that we have surrendered to the crowd and to aggressively pull them back into the private sphere. It requires the courage to have experiences that no one knows about, feelings that no one validates, and thoughts that never leave the quiet sanctuary of our own minds. 1.5. The addiction to social noise. Why is it so hard to put down the phone or step away from the crowd? It is because social noise acts as a psychological anesthetic. As we explored in the Laboratory of Silence, Module 5, the human mind is often terrified of the void. Social noisy gossip, the news cycles, the endless debates, the trivial interactions, the perfect anesthesia. It is a loud, constant distraction that keeps us from ever having to address the underlying unease of our existence. We are addicted to the noise because it is comfortable. It is easy to be distracted. It is agonizing to be present. The social seduction works because it offers us a way to bypass the hard work of self-understanding. Why sit with your existential doubt when you can scroll through a feed? Why examine your own biases when you can argue with a stranger online? The noise provides the illusion of engagement, while ensuring that no actual growth takes place. We must recognize that our reluctance to step away from the crowd is, at its core, a reluctance to heal. We have chosen the sedation of the collective over the surgery of solitude. To begin the path of awakening, we must see this sedation for what it is. We must become aware of our own cravings for the crowd. Every time you reach for your device, every time you seek out a social interaction to avoid a moment of boredom, ask yourself, what am I trying to hide from? What part of my own truth am I avoiding by inviting this distraction? In Module 2, the architecture of distortion. 2.1. The consensus reality trap. If the social seduction is the biological hunger that draws us toward the crowd, then the architecture of distortion is the structural environment that keeps us imprisoned there. We often assume that reality is a fixed, objective landscape, that the world is simply as it is, and we are all viewing it from different, clear vantage points. Buddhism, however, posits that what we call reality is, for most, a consensus hallucination. When you surround yourself with the crowd, you are effectively outsourcing your sensory and intellectual input to the group. You begin to see the world through the collective lens of your tribe, your workplace, or your social media circle. This is not a conscious choice, it is a neurological imperative. The human brain is a pattern recognition engine, and in a social setting, the most powerful pattern to recognize is the behavior of the group. If everyone around you is panicked, your brain triggers a panic response. If everyone around you is chasing a specific type of status, your brain begins to calibrate its own value systems to match that status. This collective alignment creates a consensus reality. It is a shared story about what matters, what is dangerous, and what constitutes a good life. The danger here is that the crowd does not prioritize truth, it prioritizes cohesion. The group is far more concerned with maintaining its shared narrative than it is with questioning if that narrative is aligned with the actual nature of existence. When you live in this architecture of distortion, your perception is perpetually filtered. You don't see the world, you see the group's version of the world. And because everyone else is also looking through that same filtered lens, the distortion is reinforced, confirmed, and solidified until it feels like the only possible truth. 2.2 The normalization of neurosis. One of the most insidious functions of the crowd is the normalization of neurosis. In any given society, there are patterns of anxiety, craving, and agitation that are so widespread, they are no longer viewed as problematic. They are viewed as the default setting of the adult human. Consider the modern obsession with productivity, the frantic need for constant digital stimulation, or the deep-seated fear of being left behind. When these patterns are displayed by everyone, they cease to be seen as psychological distortions. They are rebranded as ambition, connectedness, or healthy striving. This is the crowd's genius. It hides its own sickness by making that sickness universal. If you were to walk into a room where everyone was running around in a state of hyperventilating anxiety, you would immediately recognize it as a catastrophe. But when you live in a world where everyone is running around in a state of hyperventilating anxiety, you view it as being a productive member of society. This normalization is the ultimate barrier to growth. You cannot heal what you do not perceive as a wound. If your suffering is considered normal, your mind will never feel the necessary friction to seek an alternative. The crowd effectively buffers you against the truth of your own misery by assuring you that everyone else is just as miserable. It transforms the potential for an awakening into the resignation of the status quo. 2. 3. The erosion of critical insight. The architecture of distortion relies on a singular mechanism: the erosion of your ability to trust your own perception. In the crowd, insight is treated as an inconvenience. If you see something clearly, if you notice, for example, that the chase for status is actually a chase for a phantom, the crowd will instinctively try to pull you back into the consensus. They will offer you justifications. They will challenge your sanity, or they will subtly shame you for not playing the game. This is why clarity is an act of defiance. To see things as they are, to look at the frantic pace of the collective and realize it is a movement toward nowhere, is to become an outsider to the architecture. This is a terrifying position for the social brain, which is wired, as we discussed, to fear exclusion. Thus, we often find ourselves suppressing our own clear-sighted moments to maintain social harmony. We dampen our wisdom to match the volume of the room. We stop asking why, because the crowd has already decided that how is the only question worth answering. This erosion is the final stage of the prison construction. When you no longer trust your own ability to observe the nature of things, you are entirely reliant on the crowd for your reality. You become a participant in a collective dream, living out the aspirations and fears of 1,000 other people who are also looking to the group for the truth. Breaking free requires a systematic dismantling of this architecture. It requires you to consciously step back, to interrogate the normal, and to be willing to trust the silence of your own observation over the roar of the collective consensus. 2.3 The institution as a distortion multiplier. If the digital landscape is the amplifier of the social seduction, our institutions' education, corporate structures, and political systems are the primary architects of our distorted reality. We must understand that these institutions are not designed to foster individual awakening. They are designed to maintain stability, predictability, and conformity. To survive within them, we must learn to see the world through a shared, simplified lens. Consider the structure of a modern corporation. It requires that every individual operates on the same frequency of performance. It demands that you adopt the goals of the organization as your own, that you prioritize the collective KPI over your personal well-being, and that you suppress any part of your psyche that doesn't contribute to the bottom line. The institution doesn't want an awakened human, it wants a functional component. Over decades of participation, this role-playing begins to rewrite your internal architecture. You stop seeing yourself as a conscious entity with its own moral compass. You see yourself as a unit of production. You start to measure your worth by your utility to the institution, and this distortion becomes your new normal. 2.4 Education and the standardization of perception. The process of distortion begins long before we enter the workforce. It begins in the classroom. Education, in its current standardized form, is largely a process of collective calibration. We are taught to look at the same history through the same filters, to solve the same problems using the same methodologies, and to arrive at the same conclusions. This is not inherently bad, but it is a systematic narrowing of the mind. We are trained to prioritize the correct answer over the observed answer. We are taught that knowledge is something that comes from external authorities, rather than something that arises from our own inquiry. By the time we reach adulthood, our ability to see the world with fresh eyes to notice the nuance, the paradox, and the truth that exists outside the textbook has been largely conditioned away. We have been taught to trust the map of reality provided by the institution, rather than the reality itself. Breaking this distortion requires a form of unlearning. It requires us to go back and question the fundamental premises of what we were told was true about the world, about success, and about our place in the hierarchy. 2.5 The feedback loop of shared delusion. The reason the architecture of distortion is so robust is that it functions as a feedback loop. When you step into a professional or social setting, you are surrounded by people who have also been calibrated by these same institutions, because they too are invested in the consensus reality. They act as the policing agents of the distortion. When you suggest an alternative perspective, or when you act in a way that prioritizes presence over productivity, the group reacts. They might dismiss you as unrealistic, unambitious, or difficult. They are not doing this out of malice. They are doing it because your lack of distortion threatens their own sense of security. If your path is valid, their own path, which may be founded on sacrifice and conformity, suddenly called into question. This creates a powerful social gravity that pulls everyone back toward the center of the consensus. To stay out of the trap, you must learn to navigate this gravity without becoming bitter. You must understand that when the crowd resists your clarity, they are not attacking you, they are defending their own illusion. You can exist within these institutions. You can work within these structures, but you must do so with a mental sovereignty that prevents the architecture from colonizing your awareness. You become an undercover awakened observer, go through the motions required by the institution, but you are no longer believing in the importance of the game. 2.6 The pathology of urgency. One of the most effective tools used by the architecture of distortion is the manufactured sense of urgency. The institution thrives on the idea that everything is an emergency. The deadline is today. The crisis is immediate. The growth must be exponential. By keeping the mind in a state of chronic low-level urgency, the institution ensures that you are always in a reactive state. When you are reactive, you are not observant. When you are panicked, you are not wise. This state of urgency is a metabolic and psychological assault. It prevents the nervous system from ever settling into the anatomy of stillness. To reclaim your mind, You must learn to distinguish between external urgency, which the institution imposes, and internal reality, which the truth provides. You will find that most of the emergencies in your professional and social life are fabrications. They are narratives used to keep the system moving. By refusing to adopt the pace of the institution, by consciously slowing your breathing and grounding your presence in the face of their panic, you shatter the architecture's primary hold over your consciousness. You prove, through your own unwavering calm, that the crisis is a lie. Module 3. The Performative Self. 3.11 The Theater of Identity. If the crowd acts as the architect of our distorted reality, the performative self is the actor we cast to navigate that stage. In a world where we are constantly exposed to the gaze of others, the mind inevitably shifts from a state of being to a state of displaying. We learn, often at a very young age, that our internal states are not as important as our external presentations. We learn that sadness must be masked with a smile, that confusion must be replaced by a confident facade, and that our vulnerability is a liability to be guarded. This transition from the authentic self to the performative self is a form of self-alienation. We begin to treat our own lives as if we are the director, the actor, and the audience. All at once, we curate our experiences for maximum social impact, choosing where to eat, what to read, and how to speak based on the impression we hope to leave on the collective. Over time, the gap between who we are in the silence of our own minds and who we are in the theater of the crowd widens. We become strangers to our own souls, viewing our life as a movie we are projecting for others, rather than a reality we are inhabiting ourselves. 3.2 The Ego's Hunger for Validation. The engine of the performative self is the ego's insatiable hunger for validation. The ego is inherently insecure. It feels that its existence is precarious and needs constant shoring up. Validation, the form of praise, acknowledgement, inclusion, or even just the simple act of being seen, acts as a temporary nutrient for the ego. It provides a momentary sense of rightness. However, validation is a commodity that the ego never has enough of. Like salt water to a thirsty traveler, the more validation the ego receives, the more it craves. We become addicted to the social feedback loop. Every time we perform, we wait for the applause. If the applause comes, we feel inflated, but only for a moment, before the inevitable question arises. What will they think of me next? If the applause is absent, we feel a sharp, visceral sense of erasure. We fear that if we are not being perceived, we are not existing. This is the ultimate trap of the performative self. It forces us to live in a perpetual state of becoming someone in the eyes of others, while we neglect the simple, quiet reality of being someone in the eyes of ourselves. 3. The exhaustion of social surveillance. The most insidious aspect of the performative self is the internalized audience. Because we spend so much time performing, we eventually reach a point where we don't even need the crowd present to continue the act. We carry the audience with us in our own heads. We imagine how our actions will be perceived. We rehearse conversations, and we critique our own internal thoughts as if we were presenting them for a review. This is a state of constant social surveillance. It is an exhausting way to exist. Imagine walking through your daily life with a camera crew following you at all times. You would never be truly relaxed, never be truly honest, and never be truly yourself. This is how the modern mind operates. Even when we are alone in our rooms, the performative self is active, judging our worth, measuring our success, and analyzing our perceived standing in the social hierarchy. True awakening begins when we turn off the camera. It begins with the radical act of living for an audience of one yourself. It is the moment you stop asking, "How does this look?" and start asking, "How does this feel?" This is not selfishness, it is the reclamation of your energy. When you stop performing, you stop wasting the immense power of your consciousness on the illusion of impression. You become quiet, you become steady, and for the first time, you become available to see the world as it actually is, without the need to color it with your performance. 3. The liberation of being unseen. There is a profound, overlooked freedom in being unseen. We have been taught to fear obscurity, to fear being forgotten or ignored. But look at the masters of wisdom throughout history. Many of them sought out the shadows, sought out the corners of the world where they could live without the weight of a social identity. They understood that when you are unseen, you are truly free. When no one is watching, you have nothing to prove. You have no image to maintain, no status to defend, and no expectations to meet. In this state of obscurity, you can be messy, you can be confused, you can be humble, and you can be deeply, beautifully human. This is where the path of the Buddha finds its fertile ground. You step out of the theater of the crowd and into the living room of your own heart. You find that you do not need the validation of the collective to be whole, because you have finally realized that your worth is not a performance, it is a fact of your existence. Module 4, The Ethics of Withdrawal. 4. 1. Solitude as an act of integrity. In a society that worships the extroverted ideal, the choice to withdraw is frequently mislabeled as an act of rejection, elitism, or social coldness. We have been conditioned to believe that we owe our attention to everyone, at all times. We treat our presence as a public utility. However, the path of clarity suggests that the most ethical thing you can do for the world, for the people you love, is to first secure the integrity of your own mind. Withdrawal is not a turning away from humanity, it is a turning toward truth. When you are constantly tethered to the collective, your responses are rarely your own. They are reflexes, conditioned by the social expectations of the moment. You become a participant in a series of unconscious dynamics, amplifying the very noise that keeps everyone asleep. By withdrawing, you step out of that loop. You create the silence necessary to examine your own mind, to identify your own distortions, and to build an internal foundation that is not swayed by the shifting winds of popular opinion. This is a moral duty. You cannot offer the world wisdom if you are merely a vessel for the world's confusion. 4.2 The Empty Vessel Principle. There is a fundamental misunderstanding that to be good or helpful, one must be constantly engaged in the labor of the crowd. We believe that if we aren't constantly socializing, producing, or communicating, we are failing our social obligations. But consider the principle of the empty vessel. If you are a pitcher filled with sediment and murky water, anything you pour out for others will be murky. You cannot pour clarity from a mind that is constantly agitated. Withdrawal allows you to settle the sediment. It allows you to transform the murkiness of your social conditioning into the clarity of insight. When you finally return to the crowd, and you will return, you do so as a source of clean water, rather than a participant in the collective pollution. You bring with you a stillness that is contagious, a clarity that can penetrate the fog of social noise, and a presence that does not demand anything in return. Your solitude is, therefore, the most generous gift you can offer the collective. It is the act of becoming someone who is no longer adding to the chaos of the world. 4.3 The Courage of Being Misunderstood. One of the primary fears associated with withdrawal is the fear of being misunderstood. The crowd demands that you justify your absence. Why are you quiet? Why are you pulling away? What are you hiding? They will interpret your desire for clarity as a judgment of their lifestyle, or as a lack of affection for them. This is the tax you must pay for your independence. To practice the ethics of withdrawal is to accept that you will be misunderstood, and to remain unbothered by that reality. Wisdom is not about winning the crowd's approval for your journey. It is about knowing that the journey is necessary, even if no one else can see the destination. When you stop requiring others to understand your need for stillness, you have effectively severed the final cord of the performative self. You are no longer navigating by the map of social consensus. You are navigating by the compass of your own unfolding awareness. This is a lonely position, yes, but it is also the only position from which true, uncorrupted vision is possible. 4.4 The Radical Responsibility of the Witness. The ethics of withdrawal culminate in the acceptance of radical responsibility. When you are part of the crowd, you can always point to the collective and say, "I was only doing what everyone else was doing." You can blame the system, the culture, or the circumstances for your unhappiness and your lack of insight. Withdrawal eliminates this escape hatch. When you are alone, you are forced to confront the reality that your thoughts, your emotions, and your reactions are your own responsibility. You realize that no one can awaken for you. No group can provide the insight that you must earn through your own attention. You become the sole proprietor of your consciousness. This is the weightiest, most profound responsibility of the human life. It is the transition from being a passenger in the social machine to being the pilot of your own awareness. By stepping away from the crowd, you are making the ultimate commitment. A commitment to the truth of your own experience, over the comfort of the collective illusion. You are deciding that your own liberation is worth more than the approval of the world. Module 5, the Laboratory of Silence. 5.1, the Geometry of the Inner Void. When the external noise of the crowd finally ceases, when the phone is silenced, the social obligations are deferred, and the constant hum of external validation is severed, the human mind is confronted with what we call the inner void. For the modern person, this void is not a place of peace, it is a place of terror. It is the architectural space where our suppressed anxieties, our existential fears, and the raw, unadorned truth of our impermanence reside. We spend our lives filling this space with noise to avoid looking at its depth. In the laboratory of silence, we must change our relationship to this void. We must stop viewing it as an abyss of nothingness and start viewing it as the expansive, empty potentiality from which all things arise. The fear of the void is essentially the fear of the absence of the ego scaffolding. If I am not my job, not my social rank, not my history, and not my opinions, then who am I? The mind, terrified of this apparent annihilation, rushes to fill the silence with worries about the future or rumination on the past. The practice here is not to fight that panic, but to witness it. You must sit in the laboratory and observe the mind's desperate, frantic attempts to rebuild the self the moment the silence threatens to dissolve it. 5.2, the Anatomy of Mental Friction. The laboratory of silence allows for the precise study of mental friction. In the crowd, the causes of your suffering are hidden. You blame the traffic, the boss, or the partner. In silence, there is no one to blame. When you feel a sudden surge of restlessness, you cannot project it onto an external circumstance. You are forced to see the truth. The restlessness is a self-generated habit. This is the most critical phase of the practitioner's growth. You begin to map the geography of your own agitation. You notice, for instance, that your mind has a default setting for worry. You notice that every 10 minutes, it reaches for a problem to solve, even if none exists. By documenting these patterns, be treating your own mind like a specimen under a microscope. You strip the agitation of its power. You are no longer a person who is restless. You are a researcher observing a mind that has been conditioned to be restless. This distinction is the threshold of freedom. You are no longer the agitation, you are the space in which the agitation occurs. 5.3, the Dissolution of Self-Construct. As you deepen your residency in the laboratory, the self-construct, the solid, rigid story of who you are begins to soften. This is a destabilizing process. You may feel a sense of dizziness, a loss of orientation. This is normal. You are essentially removing the load-bearing walls of your identity. You realize that who you are is actually a collection of recurring thoughts held together by the glue of emotional attachment. When the glue of attachment is removed through sustained, mindful silence, the thoughts lose their cohesion. You don't disappear, but your boundaries change. You become more permeable, more fluid. You realize that the you were so obsessed with protecting was actually the primary source of your limitation. The laboratory of silence does not break you, it unmakes you so that you can exist without the desperate need for a defined shape. This is the death of the ego mask, and it is the necessary precursor to true, spontaneous, and unconditioned living. 5.4, the Threshold of Insight. The transition from noise to insight does not happen at a set time, it happens when the mind finally runs out of things to say. This is the breakthrough. There comes a moment in the deep laboratory of silence where the internal monologue, starved of external stimuli to feed upon, simply runs out of energy. The stories about the past become tired. The predictions about the future lose their thrill. In that moment of exhaustion, when the mind stops reaching, stops fighting, and stops performing, a new quality of attention emerges. It is not thought, it is not feeling, it is a raw, precise, an objective clarity. You see the world not as a projection of your desires, but as a series of events, colors, sounds, and sensations. You see the impermanence of the moment with the clarity of a mountain peak. This is not a mystical experience reserved for the enlightened. It is the natural, inevitable result of removing the interference of the noisy mind. You have reached the laboratory's conclusion. The you were protecting was the only thing preventing you from seeing the truth. Module 6. Comparison and the Status Trap. 6.1 The mechanics of social measurement. After the silence of the laboratory, the mind, if left unchecked, will inevitably attempt to re-engage with the world through its most primitive software. Measurement comparison is the ego's primary tool for calibration. In the crowd, the mind is constantly, unconsciously engaged in a frantic tally. It measures status, competence, beauty, and success, not as objective facts but as relative positioning. Am I ahead? Am I behind? Is my life more meaningful than theirs? This measurement is the direct fuel for human suffering. It is a game designed to be unwinnable, because the goalposts are always moving. When you compare yourself to those who have less, the ego is briefly inflated, but this produces only a fragile, arrogant form of relief. When you compare yourself to those who have more, the ego is punctured, leading to the sharp, acidic sting of envy. Both directions are traps. In the Buddhist view, the act of comparing is the act of denying the truth of one's own existence, treating the richness of a singular life as if it were a data point on a spreadsheet. 6.2 The illusion of the relative self. The trap of status thrives because we treat our identity as a fixed entity that can be ranked. We believe that if we achieve a higher status, the I becomes more substantial, more worthy, or more secure. But status is an abstraction, a collective agreement that has no basis in the nature of awareness. A person who is considered high status in one culture may be considered irrelevant in another. A person who is wealthy today may lose everything tomorrow. The mind clings to status because it mistakes the reflection for the source. We think that if the world views us as high status, we must be inherently valuable. We ignore the reality that the self is an impermanent, ever-changing process. Comparing yourself to others is like comparing the shapes of two clouds in the sky. It is a category error of the highest order, because we are all in constant flux, subject to different conditions, different karmic histories, and different limitation. The very act of ranking is a delusional denial of the fluidity of life. The ego loves the status trap because it provides a clear, simple, if false map of where it stands, sparing it the existential labor of discovering who it actually is. 6.3 The poison of envy and the weight of pride. Envy and pride are the two sides of the same counterfeit coin. Envy is the feeling that someone else's life is better than yours, which implies a fundamental dissatisfaction with your own reality. Pride is the feeling that your life is better than someone else's, which creates a barrier between you and the truth of your own humanity. Both emotions are manifestations of the same core error. The belief that the self is a separate entity that competes for limited resources of worth. When you remove the social measurement, these emotions wither. If you are not in the business of ranking yourself, you have no need for pride, and you have no ground for envy. You are left with a quiet, grounded appreciation for your own path. You recognize that another person's success does not diminish your potential for clarity, and another person's failure does not enhance your own worth. By withdrawing from the status trap, you stop being a competitor in a race that doesn't exist. You begin to walk your path not to be better than anyone else, but to be true to the unfolding of your own awareness. 6.4 The liberation from better and worse. True freedom is found in the dissolution of these hierarchies. It is the ability to walk into a room or to scroll through the digital landscape and watch the mind trigger its ranking reflex without acting on it. You see the reflex. Oh, look, the mind is trying to compare my salary to theirs. Oh, look, the mind is trying to compare my looks to theirs. You see the mechanism, and you gently put it down. When you consistently refuse to participate in the ranking, you achieve a radical kind of equality. You begin to see all beings as fellow travelers in the same ocean of impermanence. You no longer need to look up to anyone, nor do you feel the urge to look down on anyone. You stand on the flat, honest ground of the present moment. The status trap is finally shattered, not by destroying the crowd, but by withdrawing your consent to be measured by it. You are no longer a better or worse version of a person. You are simply an aware being, fully present, completely unranked, and finally free to live without the heavy, crushing weight of the social score. Moral sovereignty. 7.1 The recovery of the inner compass. When we spend a lifetime operating within the architecture of distortion, our moral intuition becomes atrophied. We stop asking, does this action align with the truth of my being? And begin asking, will this be accepted by the group? This is the tragedy of moral outsourcing. We have essentially handed the steering wheel of our conscience over to a committee that is more interested in stability than in integrity. To reclaim moral sovereignty is to recognize that wisdom is not a democratic process. Truth is not determined by a majority vote, nor is the validity of an action defined by the applause of the crowd. True morality, in the Buddhist sense, is an internal alignment. It is the clarity of seeing how your thoughts, words, and actions ripple through the fabric of existence. When you regain your sovereignty, you stop looking for external permission to be ethical. You begin to act with integrity because you recognize that you are the one who has to live with the consequences of your consciousness. 7.2 Integrity in the absence of an audience. The hallmark of a sovereign mind is the ability to maintain integrity when no one is watching. In the theater of the performative self, morality is often just another costumey act good to ensure we are seen as good. But moral sovereignty demands a radical shift. You act from a place of deep, silent understanding of the harm and the benefit your actions create. When you walk away from the crowd, you are forced to define your own values. You have to ask the difficult questions. What does it mean to be kind? What does it mean to be honest? These questions are no longer abstract concepts, they become the bedrock of your daily practice. You find that integrity is not a burden you carry for the sake of the collective, it is the natural, unshakable peace that comes from having nothing to hide from yourself. When you are your own final authority, you lose the anxiety of getting caught and the exhaustion of maintaining an image. You become transparent, and transparency is the ultimate shield against the delusions of the social machine. 7.3 The courage to disagree with the consensus. Moral sovereignty often looks like disagreement, because the collective mind is frequently governed by reactive fear, temporary gratification, and deep-seated biases. An awakened individual will inevitably find themselves at odds with the status quo. This is not because the awakened individual is a contrarian, but because their perception is no longer clouded by the group's consensus reality. The crowd will call this arrogance. They will label your refusal to conform as an attack on their way of life. This is where the path of the sovereign requires immense courage. You must be willing to be labeled, to be misunderstood, and to be cast aside, all for the sake of staying true to the clarity you have fought so hard to cultivate. This is not about winning an argument, it is about refusing to participate in a lie. You learn to speak your truth or to remain silent in the face of falsehood, without needing the crowd to affirm you. You realize that your value is not linked to your popularity, and your truth is not weakened by the size of the opposition. 7. For the compassion of the outsider. There is a profound irony in the path of moral sovereignty. The more you detach from the crowd's expectations, the more deeply you are able to connect with the human experience. When you stop requiring others to validate your morality, you stop judging them for their lack of it. You see them as you once were, lost in the architecture of distortion, driven by the same biological fears, and performing the same desperate dances for approval. This realization transforms your sovereignty into compassion. You are no longer a superior outsider, looking down on the crowd. You are an awakened observer who understands the deep, systemic pain of the collective. You maintain your integrity not as a weapon to judge others, but as a light to navigate the darkness. You walk your own path, you honor your own truth, and you extend a hand to others not to bring them into your camp, but to remind them that they too are capable of standing on their own. Sovereignty is the ability to be in the world without being of its madness. It is the final victory over the social machine, and it is the only place from which true, unconditioned love can begin. Module 8. The Illusion of Connection. 8.1 The difference between entanglement and presence. Having established our moral sovereignty, we must now confront a challenging realization. Much of what we call connection in our social lives is, in reality, a form of entanglement. Entanglement occurs when two or more people use each other as props for their own identity, security, or emotional regulation. It is a transactional state where the presence of the other is valued not for who they are, but for how they satisfy our internal requirements. True connection, which we might call presensis, the antithesis of this. It is the ability to stand in the company of another without needing to manipulate them, without needing to impress them, and without needing them to fill the voids in your own self-concept. In a state of presence, you are not tethered to the other person. You are two independent, sovereign awarenesses who happen to be occupying the same space. Because there is no dependency, there is no fear of loss, no jealousy, and no performative pressure. Entanglement is about holding on. Presence is about letting be. 8.2 The transactional nature of social bonds. Observe the typical social interaction. It is often a subtle, automated exchange. I will validate you if you validate me. I will listen to your story if you listen to mine. I will agree with your worldview if you provide the security of shared consensus. This is the machinery of the social machine. We form bonds based on shared delusions, and we solidify these bonds by mutually agreeing to ignore the cracks in our own perceptions. When you withdraw from the crowd to seek clarity, you will notice that many of these bonds begin to fray. This is not necessarily a bad thing, it is a diagnostic tool. It reveals which relationships were built on mutual awakening and which were built on mutual entanglement. True connection, however, does not fray when clarity increases. If anything, it strengthens, but it loses its transactional character. You stop trying to extract something from the people you love. You stop needing them to agree with your path, and you stop needing them to provide your sense of safety. You begin to relate to them with a profound, unburdened freedom. 8.3 The myth of belonging versus the reality of being. We are taught to seek a sense of belonging, as if this were the ultimate cure for our existential loneliness. We join groups, organizations, and ideological movements to feel like we are part of something larger. Yet, this belonging is a double-edged sword. To truly belong to a group, you must often surrender a portion of your uniqueness. You must adapt your language, your opinions, and your behavior to fit the mold of the collective. The awakened individual realizes that the need for belonging is a symptom of not being comfortable in one's own being. When you are deeply anchored in your own presence, the desperate, hungry need for tribal belonging dissolves. You don't need to fit into a predefined mold to feel valid. You are at home in the silence, and because you are at home in yourself, you can walk into any room or any social situation without feeling like an outsider, and without feeling the need to join the fold. You are a guest of reality, not a member of a subgroup. This is the ultimate unbelonging. You belong to the truth of the present moment, which is a far larger, more inclusive, and more permanent home than any social group could ever provide. 8.4 The art of compassionate distance. Once you move past the illusion of entanglement, you can practice the art of compassionate distance. This is the ability to be close to people, to care for them deeply, to listen to them attentively, and to serve them effectively without being drawn into their emotional turbulence. This is the hallmark of the enlightened engagement. You are like a lighthouse on a rocky shore. You are close enough to the ocean to be useful to the ships, but you are not in the ocean. You are not tossed by the waves of their drama, their fears, or their demands. You remain anchored in your clarity. You offer them your presence, not as a participant in their entanglement, but as a beacon of stability. When you stop being caught in the social machine, your ability to love increases exponentially. You love them not because you need them to be a certain way, but because you recognize in them the same capacity for awakening that you have spent your life uncovering. This is the only form of connection that does not eventually lead to suffering. It is the connection of two souls who are both, in their own way, walking home. Module 9, The Anatomy of Stillness. 9.1 The nervous system of the crowd. To understand why returning to the world after a period of solitude is so challenging, we must address the physiology of the crowd. When you are immersed in a social group, your nervous system is in a state of constant co-regulation. You are subconsciously mapping the body language, the micro-expressions, and the emotional frequency of everyone in the room. This is a high-energy expenditure. Your brain is running background processes that monitor for threat, opportunity, status shifts, and emotional cues. Even when you are relaxing with friends, your autonomic nervous system is braced, scanning the horizon for the next social requirement. This explains why, after a long social gathering, we feel a unique type of exhaustion, not physical but sensory and cognitive. We have been plugged into the collective grid. The anatomy of stillness, therefore, begins with the physiological act of unplugging. It is the process of training the nervous system to remain regulated even when the social grid is active. It is about moving from a state of external responsiveness to a state of internal anchor. 9.2 The practice of the internal anchor. Stillness is not a passive event. It is an active state of equilibrium. Think of it as a gyroscope. No matter how much the external structure the crowd tilts, the inner core remains perfectly vertical. To build this in the body, we must cultivate the internal anchor. When you find yourself back in a crowded environment, notice the tendency for your awareness to expand and dissipate into the noise. You start to feel out there, tangled in the conversations, the judgments, and the projections of others. The technique is to gently but firmly bring your awareness back to the center of your own body. Feel the weight of your feet, the rhythm of your breath, and the stillness of your own center. You are not dissociating from the room, you are simply maintaining your own frequency. You are learning to exist in the world without being colonized by the world. When you can maintain this anchor, you realize that the crowd's noise is just a vibration. It has no power to disrupt the core, unless you give it the keys to your internal house. 9.3 The neural rewiring of presence. The reason we find it hard to be still in the crowd is that our brains have been conditioned by years of reward. Loop: the dopamine hit of being heard, the adrenaline rush of an argument, the safety of being agreed with. To change this, we must engage in a process of neural pruning. We are essentially weakening the synaptic pathways that trigger the social reflex and strengthening the pathways that support witnessing. This is done through the mundane, repetitive practice of observation during social interaction. When you are in a meeting, a dinner, or a busy street, task your mind with the role of a journalist. Observe the events neutrally. Instead of participating in the emotional flow of the group, ask yourself, what is the temperature of this room? What are the patterns of these interactions? How am I reacting to this? By shifting into the role of the observer, you create a neural distance between the stimulus, the crowd, and the response, your reaction. Over time, this rewiring becomes automatic. You reach a point where you can participate in a high-stakes conversation, while a part of your awareness remains resting in the quiet, undisturbed space of your own center. This is the anatomical definition of being in the world, but not of it. 9.4 Stillness as an active defense. Many view stillness as something fragile, like a candle flame that must be shielded from the wind. This is a mistake. True stillness, once matured, is an active defense. It is a presence so grounded, so authentic, and so unmoving that it eventually creates a buffer zone around you. Have you ever noticed that when someone is truly at peace, when they are entirely present and have no need for validation, they seem to change the energy of the room? They don't need to speak to command attention. Their mere stillness acts as a gravitational field. Others will begin to settle down in their presence. Their own frantic, performative energy will naturally slow to match the anchor of the still person. This is how you use stillness to serve the world. You do not need to lecture the crowd on their distortions. You simply need to stand in your own center with such unwavering clarity that you become a mirror in which the crowd can finally see its own reflection. The stillness you have cultivated becomes a gift, offering everyone around you the permission to finally put down their own masks and breathe. Module 10, The Ordinary Awakening. 10.1, The Myth of the Mountaintop. The final hurdle in our journey is the ego's last-ditch effort to keep us trapped. The romanticization of enlightenment. We have been taught, through movies, books, and spiritual folklore, that awakening is a climactic, transcendent event, a flash of blinding light, a permanent state of bliss, or a transformation into a being who no longer feels the complexities of human emotion. We wait for a moment where we will finally arrive, where the struggle will cease forever, and where we will look upon the world with the eyes of a god. This is the ultimate delusion. It is yet another form of the chase, another goal for the ego to pursue, another future state to crave, and another way to reject the reality of the present. Awakening is not a peak experience. It is the end of the obsession with peaks. It is the simple, humble, and entirely ordinary recognition that there is nothing to be gained, nothing to be lost, and nowhere to go. It is the end of the specialness project. When the dust of our social conditioning settles, we find that we haven't become someone new. We have simply stopped pretending to be someone we weren't. 10.2 The end of the narrative. Living in an awakened state is not about living in a vacuum. It is about living without a narrative. We have spent our lives constructing a story about who we are. The protagonist of a long, dramatic saga involving obstacles, heroes, villains, and a quest for redemption. Awakening is the quiet, decisive moment where you stop writing that script. You realize that you don't need a story to justify your existence. You don't need a character arc to make your life significant. When the narrative ends, life becomes breathtakingly simple. You wake up, you drink your coffee, you work, you talk to others, you feel sadness, you feel joy, you go to sleep. You do all of this without the background hum of, is this working? Am I succeeding? What does this say about me? The narrative is what turns an ordinary life into a crisis. By dropping the story, you return to the basic unadorned fact of being alive. You become like a child again, not in the sense of being naive, but in the sense of being fully present with whatever is right in front of you, without the need to define it or defend it. 10.3 The radical normalcy of insight. The truly awakened life looks, from the outside, remarkably ordinary. You will still have bills to pay. You will still experience physical pain. You will still encounter difficult people. And you will still face the inevitability of aging and death. The difference is not in what happens to you, it is in how you hold what happens to you. You no longer view your life as a series of problems to be solved. You view it as a series of conditions to be navigated. When a challenge arises, you meet it with precision rather than panic. When a joy arises, you experience it with gratitude rather than possessiveness. You have stopped trying to hack your existence and started to simply inhabit it. This is the radical normalcy of insight. It is the quiet, unshakable confidence that you can handle whatever arises, because you have stopped identifying with the one who is reacting. You are the space, not the event. 10.4 The final return. We began this journey by withdrawing from the crowd to find our center, but the path does not end in a cave. It ends back in the world, amidst the noise, the motion, and the collective confusion. The mark of a true awakening is the ability to walk back into the marketplace as an outsider, not as a superior, and not as a victim, as a participant who is finally truly free. You walk among the people. You listen to their dreams and their fears, and you feel the weight of their social conditioning. But you are not pulled into their tide. You contribute your voice where it is skillful. You offer your stillness where it is needed, and you remain anchored in your own truth. You have no need for the crowd's approval, yet you have no desire to judge their behavior. You are simply there, a presence of clarity in a world of mirrors. You have come full circle. You left the crowd to discover that you were never separate from the source of your own peace. You return to the crowd to discover that you are never separate from the human experience. The journey is done. The chase is over. The repair project has been discarded. What remains is this moment, the breath, the sensation, the sound, the silence exactly as it is. You are home and you have never left. Code of the path is under your feet. This manifesto has explored the anatomy of the crowd, the psychology of our social dependency, and the liberating potential of the solitary mind. We have moved from the social seduction of our evolutionary history to the ordinary awakening of our current, lived reality.